Adler,
Here.
Anderson,
Here.
Bueller.
What's up guys, my name is Mark, and today's video is all about the aperture. Because let's be honest, it really is the most significant of the three exposure settings. Of course, ISO and shutter speed are important, but when it comes to controlling the look of your image, aperture is both king and queen. And royal as it may be, it's also the most complicated. Fstops. Which is why I'm dedicating this video in an attempt to help explain it. Fstops, baby. Let's start with the pretty straightforward stuff. Aperture. What is it? Well, the aperture is an adjustable opening or hole in your camera lens that lets light pass through, and depending on the diameter of the opening, controls how much light enters the camera. When you widen the aperture, it's referred to as opening up, which lets more light in. When you close the aperture, it's referred to as closing down or stopping down, which lets less light in. Another thing the aperture controls is depth of field, which is the amount of your photo that appears to be sharp from front to back. A wider aperture has a shallower depth of field, good for portraits where you want to isolate your subject from the background. A smaller aperture has a deeper depth of field, good for landscapes where you want more of the image in focus. Now the thing that most people find confusing is the actual numbers that represent the aperture settings. When you change the size of the aperture, f-stop is simply the number that your camera shows you. It's also known as an f number. And you can see on this vintage SLR lens the various aperture settings from f1.4 to f16. Now at first glance you might be wondering why f2 has a larger diameter than say f8. Why does a smaller f number mean a larger aperture? Now to understand this, it's simply a matter of perception. First of all, f-stops are not a measure of light entering the camera. The f-stop is the ratio between the diameter of the aperture of the lens and the focal length of the lens. So the aperture opening is measured in f-stops, which are, in fact, a fraction. Specifically, an aperture opening is a fraction of the focal length of your lens. So if you have a 100mm lens set to f4, what you're really saying is that the aperture opening in the lens is 1/4 of 100mm. When you substitute the focal length of a lens into the fraction, you're actually solving for the diameter of the aperture of your lens. Doing the math on that, 1/4 of 100mm is 25mm. This fraction is why a lower f-stop number is actually a bigger aperture. Take this 35mm lens at an aperture of f1.4. Simply divide the focal length, 35, by 1.4, which equals 25mm. The 25mm is the diameter of the aperture at f1.4 on a 35mm lens. Now compare that to the same 35mm lens at an aperture setting of f8, and the diameter of the aperture is much smaller at 4.375mm. Now this makes it easy to visualize why an aperture of f1.4 would be larger than an aperture of f8. Physically, at 1.4, your aperture blades are open much wider, and the diameter is bigger. That all makes sense, right? You guys ready to keep going? Now the next thing I want to talk about is that Fstop scale. And a typical Fstop scale of full stops looks like this. Each jump from 1.4 to 2 to 2.8 represents one stop of light. So by moving from F11 to F8, you're increasing the light by double. By moving from F1.4 to F2, you're reducing the light by half. The scale of Fstops is a geometric sequence of numbers, the sequence of the powers of the square root of 2. It's a bit of a mouthful, but stay with me. Start with the root of 2. 1.4. That's a familiar number, right? This 50mm lens is set to f1.4, and let's say I want to reduce the light by half, or one stop. What is the root 2 raised by the power of 2? It's 2, or f2. Going one stop further, the pattern should totally click. What's the cube of root 2? It's 2.8, or f2.8. Every time you double down the light, you raise the number of the power to root 2, and you'll get the entire sequence you'll see on your lens. When the aperture diameter increases by the square root of 2, the size of the area of the aperture is doubled. Now, the reason for choosing to use the square root of 2 scale is that it keeps the intervals equivalent to the doubling and halving of exposures, which allows for equivalent exposures. Exposure triangle. Now you might be wondering why f-stops aren't all whole numbers, and if you're using a modern lens, your f-stop scale includes more numbers than just those halving and doubling exposures. For instance, between f2 and f4, you'll also see f3.2 and f3.5. These are thirds of a stop, and they're there to give you more control over the light hitting your sensor. Now, these vintage lenses don't have that option unless you've declipped the aperture. I told you in the beginning it was complicated, right? You definitely don't need to know all of this. This is a case of TMI for sure, but I feel that understanding these principles will help you create better images. It also helps with your overall understanding of your equipment that you may have paid a lot of money for, and you might win a few Trivial Pursuit questions or two. Who knows? As stated by the late Sir Francis Bacon back in 1597, knowledge is power. Power. Alright guys, well that's it for this video. Hopefully it gave you some details you may not have known about the aperture and f-stops, the powers of the square root of 2 and all that fun stuff. If you are still awake, thanks for watching, and I promise my next video will be more active. See you guys next time. Oh, and I gotta say, I'm gonna be perfectly honest here. I had a hell of a time writing this. I hope it tracks. I know it's super complicated, and I kept going down this path of this is probably not going to be helpful for people in the end. So honestly, let me know if it did help. I'm in there in the comments if you have any questions. I'm happy to clarify a few things. But yeah, it is aperture and f-stops. Super complicated. By the way, it's like 1 in the morning right now. Everybody's sleeping. I'm pretty tired. Yeah, that's right. F-stops, baby.
Bueller.